We are in the year 1800 in the county of Southampton, Virginia. In the property records, it is just one more line, one sex, one color, one estimation of value, and one name, Nat. Nothing on the paper suggests that he will become anything other than one more body to use in the cotton and cornfields. But around this birth, something is already circulating, among the books, among the writings of the masters. Whispers, a troubled impression that this child is not quite like the others. In the cabins, the women talk. They talk low, always. They talk quickly, because the time of speaking also belongs to the master. They say that the newborn observes the world with a serious stare, as if his eyes are older than his body. They say that he hardly ever cries, that he looks at the adults as if he is waiting for an answer they do not have. Later, Nat himself said that he felt chosen, that he had been destined for great things. But no white manuscript records this intimate certainty. This feeling of exception only appears in the fragments of confessions and memories reconstructed after the fact, when the blood has already flowed. In Southampton, the childhood of a slave begins early and ends early. One does not speak of childhood otherwise. One speaks of work, of capacity for labor, of endurance. Little Nat grows up surrounded by blows, threats, and odors. The rhythm of the whip that marks the days more surely than the church bells. However, in this universe of methodical brutality, there are cracks, interstices. At night, at the bottom of the fields, the elders still whisper writings, African stories, images of lost kingdoms, names of gods that the plantation tries to erase, stories of failed revolts that one tells to the youngest so that they know, without ever saying clearly what they should do with it. The young Nat listens, always. He absorbs everything. The verses of the Bible read aloud by a white man who preaches obedience. The African proverbs that a grandmother refuses to abandon. The deformed legends of ancient uprisings that no one dares to name revolts for fear of misfortune. As soon as he can, they put a tool in his hands. His child's body is made to bend, to carry, to be silent. But his spirit escapes. In the rare moments of rest, Nat questions, observes. He notes everything, who hits, who detains, who helps in secret, who suffers. This attention to detail will become, later, a habit. For the moment, it is only a way to survive. A rumor begins to circulate around him. They say that he sees things, that he reads signs in the sky, that he sometimes talks like an adult, with the words of a preacher. For some it is nothing, for others it is a faint thread of hope, a vague promise that God has not entirely abandoned the fields of Southampton. In this universe where everything is measured, weight, age, inheritance, one thing escapes the master's accounting, the word. Nat finds it very early, in the form of biblical passages repeated until obsession. He clings to the Old Testament, to the stories of enslaved peoples, freed at the price of the blood of oppressors. He never forgets this lesson. The whites of the plantation see in him a serious boy, obedient, gifted for religion. They sometimes congratulate themselves. A pious slave is a more docile slave. They do not understand that the same text that teaches submission can also serve to ignite the fire. In Nat's head, the verses do not console. They accuse. They draw up an indictment against everything that surrounds him. As he grows, a fact becomes clear to him. On one side, the world as he sees it. Daily violence, howls, bodies marked for life by the whip, bodies sold like cattle. On the other, the world as he reads it in the Bible, a God who punishes unjust nations, who uproots the wicked, who listens to the cry of the slaves. This discrepancy becomes unbearable. Then Nat decides silently that someone must fill this gap. Around him, people begin to call him preacher, predicateur. The other slaves ask him to pray to explain the scriptures. He does not officially possess the word, but he holds it, discreetly at first, with prudent words, with sermons without danger. Then, little by little, he lets filter something else. The idea that God sees, the idea that God is not neutral, the idea that God may be on the side of the enslaved. In the master's documents, none of this appears. No mention of visions, prophecies, intuitions, just figures, evaluations, transfers of property. This contrast is at the heart of Nat Turner's story. On one side, an administered existence, exploited, classified. On the other, an inner life in turmoil, invisible to the registers, but explosive. Between 1800 and 1820, Nat lives the fundamental experience of every person educated in slavery, understanding very early that his body does not belong to him. But unlike many others, he refuses, at least in secret, to also surrender his spirit. So he builds a refuge in religious language, in signs, in vows. Each lash of the whip, each humiliation, comes to be inscribed in a broader narrative, a sacred drama where final vengeance belongs to God. The whites think they see in him a model slave, productive, pious, serious. They do not suspect that in this seriousness something else is being born, a spirit that does not forgive, a mind that adds up injuries, injustices like debts in account books, a child who grows up with the conviction that sooner or later he will demand payment. In the memory of the slaves, Nat Turner is remembered as a prophet, not a prophet who announces peace, but a prophet of wrath, judgment, blood. This title does not come from the white journals, nor from the courts, but from those who listened to him preach in the nights of Southampton, those who saw him stand motionless, his eyes raised towards the sky, as if he was looking for a sign. At the beginning, he is just a child whose name is only a line in a dusty register. But already something in the silence of the archives stirs. Under the administrative dryness of these pages, a question is hidden that no one in 1800 formulates yet. What happened the day when one of these names, one of these bodies, counted as capital, decided that history must change not just by chance, but by faith and by fire? Over the years, one thing becomes clear to those who observe the young Nat Turner. He is hungry, not just for food, not just for a little rest. He has a hunger for meaning. He wants to understand why the world is the way it is, why certain people command and whip, while others obey and bleed. On the plantation, most of the slaves do not have the right to learn how to read. Reading is dangerous. Reading is seeing the words behind the sermons, the laws behind the threats. But for Nat, the door opens. By dint of discreet detours, a master, a white child, a passing preacher, teaches him laboriously the letters, the syllables, the phrases. The first language he discovers is not that of the journals or the contracts, it is that of the Bible. They put a holy book in his hands, convinced that a slave, nourished by religion, will be more docile, more resigned. They show him the passages on obedience, humility, acceptance of his fate. They repeat that the reward is not for here, but for the afterlife. For the whites, it is a simple calculation. The cross as an extension of the whip. A God presented as the guarantor of the established order, protector of the master, guardian of the hierarchy. But this calculation is based on a fatal error. One forgets that the Bible is a book traversed by violence, anger, uprisings. And Nat Turner, he does not just read the verses chosen for him. He comes across Moses, Pharaoh, a people enslaved and delivered by plagues, blood, the drowning of the oppressors in a sea that closes over them. He reads the prophets who announce judgment, the destruction of unjust nations. He discovers a God who hates chains as much as he supports them. For him, this is not a contradiction. It is a promise. Day after the fields, he returns to this text. He recites it, chews on it, hums it. The words become invisible knives, blades sharpened in his spirit. The other slaves see him pale and alone, his eyes fixed on sacred phrases. Some find him unsettling, others start to ask him questions. How can a just God allow this? Why do they whip children, pregnant women, old people? Why do the priests not condemn the sales, the separations, the blows? Nat does not yet have a clear answer, but he refuses to say that God blesses this system. He refuses to preach a submission that is only a prolongation of the whip in the consciences. Then a double life begins. On Sundays, when a white person is present, Nat cites docilely the verses expected of him. Servants, obey your masters. He bows his head, adopts the posture of humility, and everyone congratulates themselves on this young, pious slave who knows the scriptures so well. But in the shadows at night, in the cabins, things change. There, he chooses other texts. He recounts how God strikes down unjust nations, how he overthrows the powerful from their thrones, how the blood of the oppressors eventually flows, sooner or later. His words slip into the loud air of the nights of Southampton, like a dangerous breeze. The blows of the whip do not disappear. On the contrary, each fault, each mistake, each gesture judged insolent is paid for in openly lashed chains. Nat bears the scars like all the others, but unlike many, he gives them a meaning. Each scar becomes a letter, a sign, a proof that God sees the accumulated injustice. Sometimes he has visions. Visions too clear to be just visions. He sees battles, skies stained with signs, roads stained with blood. He sees whites who flee, blacks who rise, houses in flames. When he wakes up, his heart beats very fast. The images do not disappear. He begins to interpret the smallest phenomenon, a brutal act, an animal killed, an accident in the fields, a bad omen in the sky. Everything becomes a message, a warning, a chapter in a larger plan. The other slaves listen to him, half fascinated, half terrified. Some of them whisper that he has the gift. Others say he is playing with fire. The masters, however, only notice one detail, his authority over the others. When he speaks, everyone falls silent. When he explains a verse, eyes turn towards him. This informal authority, born of the word and not of the whip, unsettles them. Therefore they watch him even more closely. One day, one of his private sermons is revealed. He had insisted too much on the wrath of God, on the fate of oppressive nations, insisted too much on the possibility of an uprising. The punishment falls brutal. The whip lashes down on him in front of the others to set an example. Nat's body bends under the pain. But this torment, far from breaking him, awakens something in him. He understands that the word has power, that each time he spoke the truth, he paid in pain. And yet, instead of being silent, he makes a choice. If his life must be an offering, it will be entirely. From then on, his preaching becomes more radical. It becomes less consolatory, more trenchant. He no longer promises only a better heaven. He begins to let it be understood that there could be one day a judgment here on earth. In this precise county, on these precise lands, the whiplashes continue to rhythm his life like that of the others. They are the daily instrument of white oppression, the sonic punctuation of the plantation. But for Nat, each lash becomes also a call. One does not whip only bodies, one whips future possibilities. One tries to kill, blow by blow, the very idea of revolt. The more he sees suffering, the more his sermons fill with fire. He thinks of Moses facing Pharaoh, of Jericho whose walls fall, of the prophets who announce the destruction of guilty cities. He begins to wonder if Southampton could one day be one of these cities, Around him, some people look at him like a dangerous fool. Others like the only voice that dares to say what everyone is secretly thinking, that this system cannot last eternally without paying a terrifying price, that patience has a limit, that resignation repeated too long transforms into poison. Nat becomes a point of convergence. People come to see him to confess their pain, their humiliations, their angers. He listens, he prays, but he also registers. He remembers each child sold, each woman raped, each man hanged. His memory becomes a living archive of the plantation, a parallel moral accounting, radically different from the white books. In his head, something is structured, a conviction that God has not abandoned him by giving him the word, a certainty that his visions are not simple illusions. It begins to dawn on him in a somewhat obsessive manner that he has chosen to act and not just to speak. The masters, on the other hand, continue to see what they want to see, a devout, serious and useful slave, a man marked by the whip and therefore tamed. They do not read his eyes when he quotes the scriptures. They do not hear what slips between the verses. As the years pass, the Bible exists, the visions repeat, the blows rain down. And between these three forces, the text, the dream and pain, Nat Turner forges himself, not just as a simple believer, but as something more dangerous, a preacher convinced that God himself demands a reckoning. At this stage, the revolt does not yet have a date, not yet an hour. It is only a shadow, a presentiment. But already, in the sweltering nights of Southampton, some sense that something is approaching, like a storm that one divines before seeing the lightning, like a verse that read too often finally demands to be put into practice. Nat Turner awaits a sign powerful enough to transform word into action. He does not yet know where it will come from, nor in what form, but he is certain of one thing. The day this sign appears, he will no longer be able to hesitate. And the Bible, which until then served to console the slaves, will become the matrix of a bloody judgment. For years, Nat Turner had been waiting for something, a sign, a break in the infernal routine of Southampton, something violent enough, indisputable enough, so that he could no longer hide behind prudence or simple pity. This sign does not come from a dream or an inner voice. It comes from the sky, from the same sky that governs masters, slaves, white and black preachers, from the sky that no one can whip, buy, or sell. We are in February 1831. The time of a phenomenon approaches, an eclipse. For the educated whites, it is an astronomical event predicted, calculated, and explained in the journals. One speaks of it as a curiosity of nature, a spectacle offered by God, but perfectly mastered by science. For the slaves, it is something else. The majority have never read the learned explanations. What they see is the sun, that burning eye that dominates their days from dawn to dusk, suddenly veiled, deformed, gnawed by a shadow. The day that steals its colors, the air that changes, the animals that fall silent. Nat Turner, on the other hand, does not simply behold the phenomenon. He awaits it. He welcomes it as one awaits an answer. In his mind, this moment is already charged with meaning even before the eclipse begins. For months, perhaps years, he has read the skies as one reads the scriptures, line by line, sign by sign. When the light declines, it is not just a spectacle for him, it is a verdict. The sun, symbol of power, order, and permanence, is mutilated before the entire county of Southampton. The world seems to waver as if God has drawn a veil, if only for a few instants, over the reassuring facade of white order. In the Bible, signs in the sky often announce upheavals, judgments, reversals of fate. Nat knows this by heart. He read, and chose these passages where the sun darkens, where the moon waxes, where the stars fall like overripe fruits. For him, the eclipse is not a hazard, it's a confirmation. He says to himself, "Behold, it's now." God has spoken, not in a whisper, but in a voice that the whole world expects. A message engraved in the light itself, impossible to ignore. However, not everyone sees the same thing. The masters speak of curiosity. They joke, they comment, they assure each other by quoting what the newspapers say, what the scholars say. Some perhaps feel a slight unease, a feeling of archaic anxiety, but the next day they return to their accounts, their fields, their purchases of human chattel. In the cabins the following night, the atmosphere is different. We remember the ancient writings transmitted from mouth to ear, of ovens sent after strange signs in the sky, of cities struck by divine wrath. We associate the eclipse with everything that's not right, the whippings, the sales, the broken families, the promises not kept by a God of justice whom we invoke in church, but whom we hide from in the fields. Nat says little, but when we question him, when we ask him what it means, he doesn't downplay it. He doesn't say, "It's just nature." He doesn't say, "Don't think about it." He lets another thing filter through, a phrase repeated, insistent. God means that he is not satisfied. In his head, a switch flips. Until now, his visions, his dreams, his lectures had prepared him, but everything was still suspended, a wrath without action, a judgment without date. The eclipse comes for him, puts a period on this unfinished phase. What was gestating becomes an injunction. He interprets the event as a mandate, an order, not a counsel or a simple possibility, but a sacred obligation. God did not obscure the sun without reason. God did not make the light tremble just for show. From this moment on, the inner voice that had been whispering to him for years no longer contented itself with commenting on the world. It demands, it clamors for action. The verses of judgment that he cited take on another color. They are no longer just distant promises reserved for an indefinite future. They become, for him, a calendar. In this change, there is something terrifying, that a man who believes he acts on divine order no longer sees himself as a simple criminal, nor even as a rebel. He sees himself as an instrument, a tool in the hands of a will greater than his own. And how do you argue against an instrument that believes it has a mandate from heaven? Nat begins to relate all recent events to the light of the eclipse, the whippings, proofs of charge, the massive sales, additional pieces in the file of judgment, the white sermons that call for patience and submission, lies meant to delay the inevitable. He also sees the fear that sometimes crosses the faces of certain masters. A little too quickly hidden, quickly turned into a joke, but, well, it is. Even they, with their journals and their calculations, know that the ode they have built is based on an unstable foundation. The idea that thousands of human beings will accept indefinitely, bowing their heads. In this context, the eclipse becomes for Nat Turner a signal of departure, a call to blood, not the blood of slaves already shed for generations, but that of the masters, that of the white families who, until then, hid behind their idols, their laws, their Bibles, interpreted to their advantage. It is important to understand this. Nat does not suddenly switch to violence. Violence is already all around him, omnipresent, daily, banal. What changes is his decision to respond to this violence with another violence, no longer just suffered, but inflicted. The sign in the sky is not just a simple spectacle. It is a message sent to Southampton County. Some see it as a curiosity, a call from the greatness of God and science. He sees it as a warning. The light will be extinguished in this world of injustice, and in this darkness, blood will flow. After the eclipse, Nat Turner is no longer quite the same. He continues to go to the fields. He continues to fish. He continues to read the scriptures. But internally, something has shifted. An invisible countdown has begun. The slaves who listen to him feel a new tension in his words, an additional weight in each phrase, as if each step moved towards a final point that no one dared to name. Some rejoice secretly, others think little of it, for they know that when blood starts to flow, it does not always obey the plan nor justice. In the archives, the eclipse of 1831 appears as a marginal note, a celestial fact. It is mentioned, then forgotten. But in Nat Turner's memory, it becomes the decisive moment when the sky itself seemed to confirm his mission. Where many saw only a passing shadow, he heard a voice. From that day on, the word alone is no longer enough for him. Visions are no longer just contemplations, but plans. The scriptures are no longer just read, they are charged like ammunition, waiting to be triggered. The sun, for a moment hidden above Southampton, leaves behind an invisible mark, a mark that is not seen on the maps nor in the registers, but that burns in the conscience of a man. Nat Turner has found his sign. The sky has darkened. Soon it will no longer be just the light of day that will be covered in shadows, but the earth itself, soiled by the blood he is about to shed in the name of the God he was taught. After the eclipse, Nat Turner no longer just prays to support. He prays to know when to act. In his head, the idea of revolt ceases to be an abstract temptation. It becomes a project, step by step, name by name, house by house. But an insurrection cannot be decided alone, even in the name of God. It needs men, des allies, des witnesses' pets to transform their complaints into visible gestures. Also, discreetly, the unions begin, not in plain view, not in the cabins where the white ears always listen, but in the middle of fields at the edge of the woods where the trees and marshes seem to engulf the voices. These places do not appear in any register, in any official catalogue, and yet for those who assemble there, they are real council chambers. Nat does not speak immediately of massacre or death. He begins with the complaint, the inventory of humiliations. He lets each one recount what they have lost: a child sold, a mother beaten, a father hanged, a woman raped. The stories resemble each other, overlap, superimpose themselves. Quickly a conclusion is imposed. If God is just, he cannot leave this unpunished eternally. In these nocturnal circles, the word circulates like a confession. Then, slowly, it transforms into a tacit agreement. It is not said clearly yet, but the idea floats. And if we became the instruments of the punishment we await, Nat Turner does not rush to precipitate the movement. He knows that fear is everywhere. The fear of white patrols, the fear of denunciations, the fear, above all, of consequences in case of failure. So he advances by degrees like a preacher who prepares his audience to hear a sermon he dares not pronounce in one block. He begins by posing a question. If God ordered us to act, would we obey? Silence. The men look at each other. Some avoid his gaze, others clench their fists. Little by little, a handful detach themselves, not the most strong physically, not necessarily the youngest, but those in whom pain and faith have mixed to the point of producing this dangerous alchemy, the certainty that it is better to die attacking than to suffer. The first names are fixed: Henry, Hack, Nelson, Sam, and a few others. All educated in slavery, all caught in the same net, but decided this time to swim against the current. From then on, the unions change nature. We no longer speak only of abstract justice. We speak of itinerary timing targets. A date begins to impose itself, the 4th of July. The day of independence, the day when white America celebrates its liberty, its rights, its rupture with British domination. Choosing this day to launch a slave revolt is to strike at the symbol's heart. It is to say without words that the independence of some is based on the enslavement of others. Nat Turner sees in this coincidence a gesture almost liturgical, a ritual act. While the whites are firing fireworks and pronouncing inflammatory speeches on liberty, blood begins to flow in Southampton. The contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. So they mentally map the county, not a map on paper, but a cartography of memory. Which house is isolated? Who owns slaves? Where can we find the doors without wanting to by excess of confidence? Who is hated? Who is cruel beyond the name? Who must fall first to break the morale of the whites? The voices become more muted. We count the possible guns, the axes, the agricultural tools that can serve as blades. We discuss the way to kill quickly to avoid the cries that would alert the neighborhood too soon. We speak coldly of women, children, old people. Not because we consider them as enemies to be killed, but because their death would destroy the illusion of total security in which the white population lives. Nat Turner listens to everything. He notes, he cogitates, he sifts. He told them that the operation must not be a simple outburst of rage, but an orchestrated action, somewhat liturgical, framed by the conviction that God himself had set its principle. He repeated that what was coming was not a personal vendetta, but a judgment. The date of July 4th spread in very low voice among the core of the conspirators. Each one carried this date like a burning secret, an invisible mark. Time contracted. The days that separated the group from the expected moment seemed suddenly too short, almost insufficient. Then brutally, everything collapsed. Nat fell ill. A brutal, invasive illness that nailed him to the ground when he had to stand up, ready to give the signal. Was it a simple biological hazard, a divine warning, a test? The interpretations multiplied. What was certain was that the revolt did not erupt on July 4th. This day passed like the others, with its chores, its blows, its prayers. In the hearts of those who expected the explosion, a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief because they were still alive. Frustration because they had to endure the routine again without knowing when the pending plan would unfold. For Nat, this failure was a profound wound. He had prepared himself to act on a sign from heaven, and there his physical body betrayed him. His temporary inability became, in his eyes, a mystery to decipher. Had God postponed the hour of judgment, or did he simply require more meticulous preparation? The meetings did not stop. They simply slipped further into the night, deeper into the woods. We became aware that the initial plan was perhaps too visible, too symbolically charged. That appearing on July 4th would have been a powerful gesture, but also predictable. So we began to think otherwise. We avoided the main roads. We exchanged information about the schools, the movement of the militias, the upcoming sales of slaves. Every detail counted: a master absent for a few days, a sick neighbor, a patrol loosened, an economic crisis. Everything that could weaken, distract, or divide the whites was taken into account. Nat Turner, now more cautious, became more secretive. He spoke less freely, chose his words better. He knew that the slightest leak, the slightest denunciation, would sign not only the project's death, but also that of dozens of innocent people. He advanced, like on a tightrope, between the necessity of enlisting men and the obligation to keep the circle as tight as possible. The idea of an uprising was no longer just alluring. It became logistical. It was inscribed in a calendar, in a schema of displacements, in a list of names and houses. The woods were no longer just a spiritual refuge where one prayed, far from white eyes. They transformed into an informal general quarters, an invisible nerve center for the archives. In the official documents of the time, none of this existed. No record of secret meetings, no drawn plan. Only a before and an after, before a slave-holding county, brutal but stable, after a massacre that burst to the surprise of all, like an incomprehensible explosion. But in the memory of the conspirators, the continuity was clear. The conspiracy was not born in one day. It had grown like an underground root, nourished at the same time by the Bible, by suffering, and by the failure of July 4th. Each night spent in the woods, murmuring plans by the light of a faint moon, brought Southampton a little closer to its point of uprising. What was being elaborated among the sounds of the trees and the marshes had no written trace, but one could reconstruct its logic: a first wave of fires to sow panic, a rapid progression from one plantation to another, the execution on the path of new slaves ready to join the march, and, behind all this, the conviction that God himself counts the words and judges the rise of the low. July 4th has passed. The revolt has been deferred, but not cancelled. Time, once again, stretches. For the whites, nothing has changed. For Nat Turner and his men, on the contrary, something has solidified. They now know they are ready to cross the limit. The next chosen date will no longer have the symbolic weight of American independence. It will have another weight, louder still, that of the inevitable. August 21st, 1831 begins like so many other days in Southampton. The sun rises over the fields, the birds fall silent, the cows get moving. The masters think of their crops, their debts, their business. The slaves think of holding on until evening. Nothing in the records indicates that this day is different. However, for Nat Turner, the decision is made. This time, there is no reprieve, no illness to keep him grounded, no symbolic date to honor. It is this Sunday, without fanfare, without celestial sign, without fireworks. Just a loud and muggy night, charged with what the archives never write: determination. All day, Nat works like the others. He obeys, he responds, he bends to the imposed rhythm. Nothing in his gestures betrays the inner rage, but he counts. He counts the hours, the tasks, the distances. He observes who is at home, who is absent, who drinks a bit too much at the end of the afternoon. Deep within him, a phrase emerges, insistent, like a refrain. One does not come back in airy. Once night has fallen, once the first guard has been posted, there is no longer any pardon, no possible negotiation. It is not only his life that he puts at stake, but that of all those who have accepted to march with him. In Southampton, Sunday is supposed to be a day of rest, of peace. One reads the Bible, one sings hymns, one speaks of peace, of love, of charity. This day, the same words circulate, pronounced by lips accustomed to religious routine. But for certain men in the midst of the benches, these words leave a bitter taste. They know that as evening falls, this Sunday will become something other than a simple day of worship. Evening comes, the plantations sink into a false tranquility. The masters eat, dine, speak of politics, of economic depression, of the diffuse fear of new revolts that have been spoken of in hushed tones since Haiti, since Gabriel, since the old rumor of several decades that slaves could one day rise. They expect that here in Southampton this will not happen, that they have the militias, the laws, the patrols, that they hold their people firmly. Meanwhile, other men move at a slow pace, without precipitation. Each one leaves his space like any other night, without any visible hurry. But all march toward the same point, a zone of marsh that is called, in the writings, near Cabin Pond. Cabin Pond. This name does not appear in good standing in the account books. It is a marginal, humid place infested with insects, a corner of land that the master does not use, where night swallows the silhouettes. For Nat Turner and his companions, this piece of marsh becomes this evening a new sanctuary, a place where they prepare to pronounce a yes that weighs more than all their past prayers. They arrived one by one: Henry, Hack, Nelson, Sam, and a few others, this small core who had agreed to surpass the few, or whose few had transformed into something else. No one came by chance. Each came to consent or to learn at the last moment. The silence between them is loud. They know the consequences. They know that if someone speaks, if someone wavers and becomes a white man, this marsh will perhaps become their tomb. Each carries in their memory the faces of those they risk condemning in case of failure: a mother, a child, a sister who is a slave. Nat Turner speaks, not at length, not as in his sermons of old. His voice is precise, cutting. He calls the signs, the years of suffering, the biblical promises. He says that the time is no longer to count the blows of the whip, but to weigh the blood that will be shed in the fight. He promises neither assured victory nor miracle. He does not lie. He says that many will die, perhaps all, that the oppression is terrible, that the name of Southampton will be pronounced with horror for a long time, that the whites will treat them as monsters, fanatics, savages. But he adds one thing: God, he knows what they have lived, and God, he knows the exact weight of what they are about to do. In this thick night, his words slide like a sort of inverted liturgy. Instead of preparing souls for resignation, he prepares them for the fight. In the name of the same God, with the same texts, but turned like a blade. The men speak in turn. Certain ones confess that they are afraid, that they do not want to see more dead children, that they tremble at the idea of holding a blade above a white face asleep. Nat does not minimize. He simply says that for generations it is their children who have been sold, beaten and kissed under the eyes of their parents, and that the system that permits this will not fall with simple prayers. An agreement forms, fragile but real. They fix a beginning. They attack immediately where Nat knows the house, the habits, the weaknesses at Joseph Travis, the man who employs him. It is there that the first blood will flow. The others will follow, from house to house, from family to family. They agree on signals, on names to spare, if there are any, on white slaves or poor people who can be left alive. Everything is not clear. Everything is not codified. They are not a professional army. They are men who have decided, in a marsh, to transform their rage into an approximate strategy. Certain ones have appointed a little novelty. One shares a last non-fugal moment which resembles a mix of funeral vigil and pre-battle step. Each one knows that it could be about their last piece of bread, their last drop of water, their last moment among those who comprehend them. Nat Turner, pie, again, not to ask for peace this time, but to ask for the force not to yield, the force to continue to strike, even when blood splatters their hands, their clothes, their faces. He asks God not to turn away from what they are going to do, not to abandon them at the last moment like one abandons a tool that has become useless. Then comes the moment of absolute silence, the tipping point, the time when no argument is truly valid, where there is only one question, simple and naked: are you with us or not? One by one, the men give their assent, a word, a gesture, a look. They bind themselves to each other, without paper, without signature, but more firmly than any contract inscribed in the archives of the whites. Above them, the sky of Southampton does not show any extraordinary sign, no eclipse, no comet, just the night and the stars, indifferent. The journals do not note, for this evening of August 21, anything particular. The plantation dot, the county, sleeps slowly. But in this marsh, something has just been decided that cannot be undone. A fragile fountain has been dug. These men no longer see themselves only as victims. They perceive themselves as agents of a judgment to come. The next day, they will no longer be anonymous slaves. They will become, in the eyes of the white world, assassins, rebels, demons. For the moment, they are only shadows in the night. Silhouettes tempered by sweat and fear, handling tools that will become arms. They separate, each one expecting the path to their plantation, watching not to attract attention. They carry with them a loud conscience, almost unbearable. This night is the last normal night. In a few hours, the white houses will open under their hands, no longer to serve, but to kill. In a few hours, this county, which the archives describe as a simple administrative unit, will have another name in the memory of the survivors, an improvised altar where blood will come to wash or aggravate centuries of injustice. Cabin Pond was, for those who knew, the place where the future changed direction, where chained men decided to break the implicit pact of submission. Nothing indicates it on the maps. But on the night of August 21, 1831, a decision was sealed there, a decision that, the following morning, would translate into cries, raised blades, and fallen bodies. The conspiracy is no longer a project. It has become a mortal promise. The next step is inevitable. Cross the threshold of the first house and make the first blood flow. On the night of August 21 to 22, 1831, the county of Southampton sleeps. The dogs are dozing, the shutters are closed, the lamps are extinguished one by one. Nothing in this silence lets one guess that American history is at the point of deviating from its trajectory. Nothing except a small handful of men who march towards a white house. This house, it's the one of Joseph Tavis, a master among others, not the most powerful nor the most famous. In the eyes of the slaves, he's an ordinary master, just a name on the list of men who own other men. For Nat Turner, it's the house where he lives, where he sits, where he observes the daily mechanics of white authority. He knows each door, each window, each creak of the floorboards. He knows how the rooms are arranged in the space, the master and his family in the bedrooms, the white apprentice under the roof, the slaves relegated to the attic. He knows who snores, who often turns in his sleep, who leaves a candle lit for too long. He knows, above all, that tonight they sleep without suspicion. The conspirators advance in the darkness, muffling the sound of their footsteps. They don't carry rifles slung over their shoulders like a regular army. They have what they could find: axes, knives, clubs, tools transformed into weapons. The metal is rusty, dull. What will make the difference is not the quality of the steel, it's the will to use it. One can imagine, without the documents saying it, the weight of this moment. For years these men have been entering this house to serve, to light the fire, set the table, clean the dishes of the master's daily life. Tonight they cross the same threshold for a different function: to kill. Nat Turner doesn't hesitate yet. He bears the decision like a sacred burden. He has long spoken of judgment, divine wrath, Moses and Pharaoh. Now, these writings must translate into precise gestures, impacts, blows. The threshold between the prophet and the murderer narrows to a few seconds. According to the writings collected afterwards, they start with Joseph Tavis himself, a man who doubts, convinced that the world that has protected him until now will protect him still tonight. The injustice of his daily life doesn't appear to him as injustice. It seems normal, natural, sanctioned by law, by custom, by God. In a few instants, this normality is shattered. The blow falls once, twice. The first blood flows in this house where ordinarily only the slaves bleed, under the whip or the club. This event has a tremendous symbolic force. For the first time, the white body is no longer inviolable. It's no longer protected by the invisible fabric of power, law, custom. At that moment, the white documents describe it with hesitant words: atrocity, massacre, barbarity. They detail the wounds, the brutality of the blows, the vulnerability of the victims. They insist on the fact that the attackers struck people who were asleep, defenseless. They reason that the scene is atrocious. But what these same documents don't say is that slavery itself relies on the same principle. Strike those who can't defend themselves, bind, sell, rape, destroy lives that have no recourse. For the conspirators, this event is not a crime. It's, in their eyes, a traditional symmetry, a response. The violence doesn't stop at the master. His wife is killed. The child, too, a white apprentice, falls at his feet. In the logic of Nat Turner and his men, there can be no sanctuary in this house, no zone preserved where blood does not flow. Each white breath left alive represents a potential alarm, a patrol, a militia on the move. There, however, the later writings insist with horror on the children, on the fragility of their corpses, on the indignity of touching them. This disgust, this expulsion are real, but in the heads of those who act, other images superimpose themselves. Children sold to their masters, sold like cattle. Infants left without pity, corpses thrown after the whip blows, lives destroyed before they even began. Nothing excuses the massacre. But the documentary does not seek to excuse. It seeks to show the terrible logic that leads to this threshold. When a system transforms certain lives into objects, into capital, into available corpses, it should not be surprising that the day when violence mounts the chain, it strikes without distinction. In this house, in the heart of the night, the theology of Nat Turner materializes. God is no longer a distant spectator whom one invokes in psalms. He is, for these men, present in each gesture. The blood that stains the ground is not for them a simple liquid. It is the proof that judgment has begun. After the first massacres, a strange void must be made, a kind of internal silence. For years, the revolt has been a word, a vision, a hypothetical future. Now it is there, irreversible. They have crossed a line that was not expected. The return to docility is impossible. The chains can no longer be imposed on them as before. It is probable that a moment of vertigo seizes them. A question. And now, but there is no time to dwell on it. The plan requires continuing. The next house awaits. The mechanics of death must be set in motion before the county awakens. The archives speak of that moment with horror. The slaves, led by Nat Turner, massacred the Tavis family. A line, a few words, nothing that accounts for the psychic, religious, historic charge of this passage to action. Nothing that says the fear, the panic, the sweat, the trembling hands, the mixture of sacred and horror that invades these men. For the whites, this inaugural scene will become the founding text of their version of the revolt. A night of incomprehensible savagery, a rupture of the imaginary pact according to which the slaves, well treated or not, were eternally submissive. For the conspirators, it is another thing, the proof that they dared, that they did not only have vengeance, but that they did it in history by the most bloody path. The house of Joseph Tavis no longer exists today as it existed in 1831. The times have changed, the generations have passed, the landscape has transformed. But in the memory of the writings, it is the place of the first blood, the starting point of a trajectory that was bloody and flashing, which led Nat Turner and his men from farm to farm, from death to death, until the inevitable outcome. From this moment on, each step they take will be guided by what they have just accomplished. They are no longer simply victims, nor even conspirators. They have become, in their own eyes and in the eyes of the world, another thing, men who have chosen to respond to the most brutal system of their time with a brutal shock. And this choice sealed in the blood of the first house, marks forever the name of Nat Turner in the archives and in the whispers of Southampton. The first blood has flowed, the county still sleeps, but an invisible line has been crossed. From now on, it is no longer just slaves who have masters. These are the masters who, soon, by learning what happened in the Tavis house, discovered that they had always lived on the edge of a volcano that they themselves had fueled. On the morning of August 22nd, 1831, the news of the death of the Tavis family had not yet left the mouths of the house. The county of Southampton wakes up slowly, ignoring that the night has given birth to something other than an ordinary Sunday. In the records, that day is still an empty date. But for Nat Turner and those who accompany him, it is already written as the beginning of a march that will only end in blood and dust. They leave the Tavis property without ceremony, like men who have work to finish. There is no discussion, no shout of victory. Only this loud and silent conviction, since they have started, they must go to the end. To retreat now would be to expose themselves to an even more terrible vengeance. The only way out is to move forward from farm to farm, leaving behind them the bodies that will finally make the masters understand that the slaves, too, can become the catastrophe they dread. The procession has nothing of a spectacular military campaign. No flags, no music, no orderly column. These are a few men, then a score, armed with crude tools, advancing along the roads, crossing fields they know better than the official maps. Their strength is not in their equipment, but in the intimacy they have with this land. Each plantation on their route is a place of remembered pain, a scene of forced labor, of blows, of humiliations. They know which houses are vulnerable, which families are numerous, which distances separate them from the neighboring farms. The archives, more detailed, describe the list of victims house by house, name by name. But what these dry lines do not say is the atmosphere of this march, a mixture of religious fervor, accumulated rage, and visceral fear. Yes, these men have feared failure, feared death, feared what they will become in the act. At each step, the logic is the same. Surprise, strike quickly, leave neither capable witnesses nor time to organize a defense. The violence is brutal, without elegance, without distance. Axes, sticks, and improvised blades do the work that the law, for decades, has refused to do. The white bodies that fall are suddenly multiplied in this corner of Virginia, that the newspapers will later describe as plunged into terror. People speak of 50, maybe 60 white deaths. Historians debate the exact figures. Little matter. What counts is the perception of those who survive. The idea that for a few hours the social order has wavered to the point of making the color of the skin, for some, as vulnerable as that of the slaves who were flogged the day before without hesitation. As they move forward, Nat Turner and his companions are not alone. At each plantation, an implicit question is asked of the other slaves: "Are you staying, or are you following us?" For some, the answer is immediate. They join the group without a word, as if their bodies had been waiting for this signal for years. For others, the dilemma is more cruel. To stay is perhaps to survive at the cost of prolonged submission. To leave is to risk being hanged, imprisoned, or worse. There are those who grab a weapon and join, those who hesitate and then flee, those who prefer to serve their masters out of loyalty, sincerity, or calculation. The revolt does not unify the slaves, it exposes them. It reveals the factions, the opposing survival strategies, the internal compromises that each has made to survive in a world that enslaves them. The white documents of the time insist on the faithful slaves who saved their properties, allowing some to flee, slowing down the mutiny. They make them exemplary figures, models of obedience in the storm. But behind these flattering portraits are hidden more complex stories. The terror associated with the revolt, the fear of seeing their family massacred in retaliation, the hope, often disappointed, of obtaining better treatment in exchange for this loyalty. In the dust of the roads, Nat Turner must face this reality. Not all blacks follow him. Not all believe that God has chosen this moment to act. Not all accept paying the price of an uprising whose outcome is anything but certain. The louder the column becomes, the more it becomes messy. Men join the movement without fully understanding the plan, attracted by the idea of finally striking the enemy, of holding a weapon for something other than cutting wood or harvesting cotton. The brutal rage mixes with the quasi-liturgical dimension that Nat had wanted to give to the insurrection. What he imagined as a structured judgment begins, in some places, to resemble a more diffuse vengeance. The boundary between justice and chaos becomes blurred. Where Nat still sees a mission, others, less scrupulous or more biased, see an opportunity to reverse, for a few hours, the absolute power balance. In the newspapers, people will later speak more of hordes of armed slaves attacking women, spreading death at random. Reality is both more precise and more tragic. It is not chance that guides the procession, but the geography of slavery, the roots that link the grand white families, the plantations where masters and slaves are concentrated, the houses where the memory of a particularly cruel treatment has left its mark on black memories. However, in the precipitation, decisions are made that, even in the eyes of certain conspirators, seem to exceed the measure. Children die again and again. Women implore and are not spared. The military logic, eliminate all witnesses, mixes with an older age, nourished by decades of focused impotence. As they advance, step by step, another force sets itself in motion, the white crowd. The survivors, the alerted neighbors, the frantic messages begin to spread in the opposite direction. People get on horseback, rush towards the cities and villages, knock on doors to announce that the slaves have risen, that they are killing, that they are advancing. The rumor grows with each mouth that repeats it, sometimes inflating the figures, multiplying the horrific details, real or imagined. In a few hours, Nat Turner and his men are no longer just a mutinous group in a rural county. They become a specter that haunts the white imagination, the materialization of all the nightmares that one has always repressed, with more stringent laws, louder whips, and more frequent patrols. For the conspirators, this spread of rumor is both a goal and a danger. They wanted to blow up the illusion of security to show that slaves can strike at the heart of white homes. They succeed. But they also know that the more the rumor spreads, the more rapid, massive, and implacable the response will be. At each plantation, they wonder if they still have the initiative, or if, already, somewhere, militias are gathering, guns are being loaded, and cannons are being put in place. Time is against them. What was to be a triumphant march towards a wider uprising gradually becomes a race against time. Nat Turner continues to invoke God, but his prayers change in tone. It is no longer just the God of judgment that he calls upon, but also that of protection, almost justification. As the words accumulate, even in his spirit, a question arises. How far should one go? Is there a point where judgment becomes indistinguishable from what it punishes? He does not have the luxury of reflecting on this for long. The steps follow one another, the flames align. The mechanism he has triggered cannot be interrupted in the middle of its trajectory without everything imploding on them. In the archives, Nat Turner's mutiny is summarized by tables, names of victims, places, dates, a glacial accounting that only retains the white angle of history. For the slaves who look at this armed column, the spectacle is more ambiguous. Some see in it a sign that the time of perpetual humiliation is coming to an end. Others already suspect what will follow. The hangings, the mutilated bodies exposed as an example, the laws made even more severe, the inflammatory sermons on the need to keep the blacks under a stricter yoke. Between these two visions, the march continues implacable like a tightrope stretched over an abyss. At the end of this day of blood, one thing is certain. Southampton is no longer the same county. The slave-owning order, even if it will provisionally recover its structure, has been fractured in its most intimate zone, the house, the bed, the night. The masters now know that those they whip, sell and baptize can one day come to fetch them in their own chambers. Nat Turner, for his part, is no longer just a preacher with troubling visions. He has become the face, or the mask, of a violence that slave-holding America carries within itself, and which, in this month of August 1831, has chosen to leave the shadows to traverse, from farm to farm, the dusty roads of Southampton. Very quickly, Nat Turner's march ceases to be a secret. It takes only one child who escapes, one frantic horseman, one master who manages to flee through a hidden door for the rumour to leave the dusty roads of Southampton and reach the larger roads, the villages, the offices where one keeps the registers, and the arms. In a few hours, the words spread like a fire. The slaves have risen. They are killing. They are advancing. The news is not just information, it is the materialization of all the nightmares that the whites have always repressed in a corner of their mind, while still fearing them enough to maintain a permanent arsenal of laws, patrols, and threats. This time, it is no longer theoretical. The nightmare has a name, a county, a leader. The first response comes from the immediate surroundings, the neighbors, the nearby planters, the local militias. People get on horseback, search the surroundings for guns, ammunition, and old war arms that have been gathering dust since the Independence War. Those who, the day before, had ridiculed the idea of an organized uprising suddenly become improvised soldiers, their faces deformed by a crowd that is quickly transforming into a mob. The bells ring, messages spread in all directions. The available white men are summoned, clubs are distributed to those who do not have a gun, and the faithful slaves are gathered to keep an eye on them or to use them as guides. The slave-holding society, seized with panic, reforms itself and mounts its true nature, an order that only holds up when propped up by the threat of massive violence. But very quickly, this local device is no longer sufficient. The amplified rumor affirms that hundreds of slaves march, that the flames will engulf the houses, that women will be raped, that children will be massacred. This is exaggerated, deformed, and repeated, and with each retelling the tale becomes more grandiose than reality. Then the authorities are called, messages are sent to the militia of Virginia, then to the authorities of North Carolina. More structured units are deployed, with officers, flags, and written orders. Where Nat Turner moves with axes and sticks, the state advances with flintlock rifles, light artillery, uniforms, and drums. The military machine that served to chase the British or confront other powers now turns against the black population of Southampton, insurgent or not. In official writings, everything unfolds peacefully. The militias encircle, disperse, neutralize the rebels, arrest the main instigators, and establish order. Reality, however, is much more troubled, much more sordid. As soon as the first armed cavalrymen arrive in the areas where the revolt has struck, the distinction between the slaves involved and those who have done nothing disappears rapidly. In the eyes of the exhausted, frantic, and bewitched militiamen, every black man of an age to bear arms becomes a suspect, every gathering a conspiracy, every word a potential lie. The reflex is not to investigate, but to strike. They hang, shoot, stab. They prevent future revolts by punishing indiscriminately all those who have the same skin color as the insurgents. One also sees the unleashing of what the slave-owning society had reserved for its worst scenarios, unbridled white violence. Groups of planters and small landowners, sometimes drunk, sometimes simply galvanized by fear, constitute themselves into improvised squads. They scour the countryside, interrogate summarily, judge on the fly, and execute on the spot. They leave corpses hanging from trees, bodies at the bottom of roads, and inflict what the reports called, euphemistically, exemplary punishments. Behind this vocabulary, a reality hides dozens, perhaps hundreds of blacks killed without trial, without investigation, sometimes simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The blood shed by Nat Turner and his men becomes the pretext for an infinitely larger outpouring of black blood. In this atmosphere saturated with panic and vengeance, the figure of Nat Turner takes on an almost mythic dimension. He is seen everywhere. He is situated here, then there, in the woods, in the marshes, at the head of an invisible army. Every rustle in the forests, every silhouette seen in the distance in a field becomes a possible apparition of this prophet who has become, for the whites, the face of absolute evil. This obsession contributes to fueling the brutality of the repression. As long as Turner is not captured, as long as his corpse does not hang before the eyes of the whites, the county does not feel secure. And while waiting for that moment, they strike by substitution. What they cannot do to Nat, they do to others. Paradoxically, this rise in white terror does not immediately establish order. For a few days, confusion reigns. Militias from different places intervene without perfect coordination. Orders contradict each other. Rumors of new foci of insurrection surge, often exaggerated or entirely false. In certain locations, whites hold other whites in a state of panic. The boundary between repression and chaos becomes blurred. This disorder reveals a reality that the slave-owning elites do not like to see. Their system, so disciplined in appearance, is based on a permanent threat of collapse. The revolt of Nat Turner did not create this threat, it simply made it visible. For those slaves who did not participate in the revolt, this period is a nightmare within a nightmare. They know they are regarded as potential enemies, that the slightest expression of sadness for the insurgents, the slightest misinterpreted word, can cost them their lives. Some try to prove their loyalty, which is rewarded as much as possible, short of being alive. Others hide, keep silent, hoping to weather this storm of violence without being caught. Families live in constant fear of seeing a father, a son, a sister taken away and never returning. Patrols, searches, and interrogations punctuate the days and nights, leaving in their wake a feeling of total asphyxiation. As the days pass, the overwhelming superiority of the white military apparatus takes its toll. Turner's column has already fragmented, dispersed, and weakened. Some rebels are killed in combat, others captured, others still manage to flee temporarily, hiding in the woods and marshes. There is no grand final battle, no heroic charge in the manner of nationalist writings. There are a series of brutal collisions, flights, and punctual arrests. The crushing of the revolt is not a scene, but a process, a methodical sweep through a territory that one claims to cleanse. Every black person found armed is executed or sent to an expedited trial. Every disarmed but suspicious black person becomes a potential target. When the state begins to extend its hand over the repression, trying to channel the fury of the planters and the savage militias, it is not out of kindness, it is to re-establish control over the narrative. Leave the massacres to continue without judicial menace threatening to transform white vengeance into an uncontrolled spectacle, potentially cited outside. Also, they established tribunals, drafted acts of accusation, and organized rapid trials. They gave the appearance of justice where, in reality, the outcome was almost always known in advance. The message is double. To slaves, it shows that the state does not joke with revolt. To whites, it shows that violence must pass through institutions to be legitimate, even when it is muted. It is in this context that the black legend of the revolt of Southampton was created. The Southern journals insist on the barbarity of the insurgents, the power of the victims, the necessity of being even more in control of black populations. Those of the North, even abolitionists, often struggle to adequately face the complexity of the uprising, sometimes preferring to make it a simple symptom of the evil of slavery rather than confront the disturbing question, what happens when those who are oppressed without respite decide to respond in blood, not with sanctity or flight, but with massacre? In all cases, it is the whites who write, who publish, who fix the words. The black version, that of the surviving slaves, is largely lost in the silence imposed by fear. The extinguishing of the revolt does not limit itself to the corpses left on the soil of Southampton. It continues in the laws voted afterward, in the new restrictions on education, assemblies, and black predications. But already in these precise days of August 1831, everything is there, concentrated, the visceral fear of the dominant class, the disproportionate violence of the response, the obstinate refusal to see in this bloody explosion anything other than an isolated madness. Nat Turner and his men are tracked, dispersed, killed, or made prisoners. The muted march ends, but the trace it leaves is indelible. It reveals that under the veneer of order, the slave society is only a fragile equilibrium, maintained by the permanent threat of militias, firearms, cannons, and that white fear which, when unleashed, distinguishes little better than the violence it pretends to abolish. When the firing of rifles falls silent, when the cries dissipate in the loud air of the end of summer, there is something that the militias have not managed to grasp. Nat Turner himself. The column of rebels is crushed, the accomplices are hanged, shot, or chained awaiting their trial. The black corpses pile up in white writings like so many warnings. And yet, in the midst of this field of human ruins, an absence weighs more heavily than all the corpses hanging from the trees. The preacher. The man for whom everything began has disappeared. Very quickly, his absence becomes an obsession. For the authorities, as long as he is not captured, the revolt is not completely finished. The chaos is not entirely dissipated. Nat Turner becomes more than a man, a shadow, a phantom, a silhouette that one thinks one sees between two trunks of trees. One imagines that he hides in the woods, that he sleeps in cavities of the soil, that he nourishes himself with roots, wild fruits, with what the earth wants to leave him. One situates him here, then there, always at the edge, never quite present. At each rumour, one sends patrols, one searches the woods, the marshes, the isolated cabins. One interrogates, one threatens, one promises rewards, but for weeks nothing. The county lives in a state of tension. Officially, order is established. The militias patrol, the slaves are terrified, the trials begin to judge those considered instigators or followers. In fact, a continuous unease gnaws beneath the surface. Every creaking in the woods can be him. Every footstep in the mud, every broken branch, every field at the periphery of the county is suspect. As long as Turner breathes, the system never feels completely at ease. It is enough that he finds a way to rally other men for the fire to ignite again. This risk, even minimal, is unbearable for those who have built their security on the idea that slaves never rise up. For the slaves, this period is even more ambiguous. Nat Turner is at once a source of secret dread and a tangible menace. Having followed him, having listened to him, having protected him, may mean death. But knowing that he still escapes the whites despite the dogs, the rifles, and the rewards has something almost supernatural. He becomes, in the nocturnal whispers, a spirit of vengeance that refuses to be hanged. Some claim to have seen him, thin, dirty, the eyes burning, gliding between the trees like a shadow, determined never to surrender. Others have only echoes, rumors, but they are enough to nourish the idea that even defeated, the revolt has not been entirely stifled. And he, where is he really? One guesses that he is hidden in the corners of this territory that he knows better than many whites, the humid woods, the vines, the clumps of earth that he transforms into precarious refuges. One imagines him huddled in a hiding place so narrow that he cannot stand up, only coming out at night to search for a little water, a piece of food. Hunger is no longer a simple discomfort, but a constant presence that gnaws at the nerves and blunts thoughts. His body weakens, his clothes wear out, his skin covers itself with mud, leaves, and scratches. The man who once preached standing, Bible in hand, now looks like a hunted animal. But a hunted prophet remains a prophet in his own mind. In this forced silence, Nat Turner continues to dialogue with the God he believes sent him. Solitude is saturated with questions. Did he truly comprehend the sign? Did he obey or tarry? The words that now litter Southampton, are they the legitimate price of necessary judgment, or the mark of a heinous error? The scriptures he once wrote to assemble become, in his hiding place, an unforgiving mirror. He thinks of Jonah fleeing the divine mission, of Elijah hidden in the desert, nourished by ravens, except that for him there is no spectacular miracle, just mud, thorns, a few drops of dirty water, and the buzz of patrols passing in the distance. Sometimes he hears the dogs. Their barking approaches, recedes, approaches again. They are brought to track the footsteps of insurgents, to scour the woods and marshes. Nat knows he cannot count on his body to run indefinitely. His only asset now is his knowledge of the terrain and an obsessive prudence. He stops leaving footprints, avoids obvious places, changes hiding spots as soon as he feels the noose tightening. Each move is an improvisation. What if their eyes glance? What if their dogs stumble? What if their guns fire into the void? While the whites hunt him in the woods, they judge him in their words. Letters, journals, reports stage a man who is both monstrous and almost supernatural. They exaggerate his influence, portray him as a fanatic possessed, a demon disguised as a preacher. The more he escapes capture, the more this portrait is consolidated. Nat Turner becomes a mythological figure even before being caught. For some, he is the black devil who roams the forests. For others, he is the embodiment of the internal threat that can never be fully controlled. In all cases, his clandestine existence nourishes propaganda. It is repeated that as long as the slightest breach is tolerated in the discipline imposed on blacks, other Turners will be born. For him, this transformation into a living ghost has a price. He is no longer surrounded by his companions, either killed or captured. He no longer preaches before a circle of attentive slaves. He has no voice, no public, no community. His only company is his painful memories and the sound of his heart when he hears branches crack. He thinks of the faces of those who have fallen, of the families assassinated, of the black bodies hanged in reprisal. His memory becomes a cemetery, and in this cemetery he obstinately searches for coherence. If all this was in vain, then his flight is only a prolonged agony. If all this has a meaning, then his clandestine survival is still part of the plan. The days become indistinct. Time is no longer measured by church bells or work hours, but by the distance between patrols, by the frequency of battues, by the repetition of the same sounds in the same woods. Southampton, for him, is no longer a county. It is an open-air cage, immense and yet suffocating. Escape is almost impossible. Surrender is unimaginable. Being hidden indefinitely is unbearable. He is suspended in a state of limbo that resembles a terrestrial purgatory. The whites think they are tracking him in the forest. In reality, the hunt is most ferocious in his own spirit, and yet despite this fatigue, despite the ordeal, he continues. Each day spent on the run is an additional slap in the face of white authority, a reminder that their power is not absolute. Each night he is not captured extends the insult that, for them, represents the idea of a slave in flight, having dared to defy the established order. The entire county becomes a manhunt machine. They promise a reward for any information. They interrogate brutally. They search the huts of blacks. They even spy on those they call faithful. Nat Turner, alone invisible, becomes the axis around which a collective paranoia turns. For the slaves who hear about this hunt, a lesson is imparted, chilling. This is the cost of insurrection. This is how far the whites are willing to go to capture the one who has shattered the illusion of their security. But another lesson, more subtle, also slips into minds. A man educated in slavery has managed for weeks to stand up to the state, to the army, to the militias, simply by refusing to die at the appointed time. Whether one admires or condemns him, this single idea is enough to haunt the nights of Southampton. When he is finally discovered and captured, dirty, famished, caught in his hiding spot like an animal caught in a trap, it is not the end of his legend. It is, on the contrary, the beginning of another phase, more rigid, more scripted, the one where his body will be delivered to white justice, and where his words, recorded, transcribed, will become a text that will be invoked for generations. But during these weeks where he runs in the woods, Nat Turner is neither a text nor an icon. He is a living ghost caught between the conviction of having obeyed God and the horror of what he has unleashed. A man whose simple existence, hidden under the earth of Southampton, was enough to show that slavery, despite its laws and its might, had never managed to completely extinguish the possibility of rising up and fighting. When they finally capture Nat Turner at his hideout, it's not a prophet they exhibit, but a worn-out, defeated man, his traits ravaged by weeks of being on the run. However, in the eyes of the whites of Southampton, his capture has a somewhat liturgic quality. It's the moment when they can finally put a face to the phantom, give a name to the enemy, and transform the elusive ghost into a body handed over to justice. They bind him, lift him, and transport him like a living proof that order has been restored. But very quickly another question arises: what to do with his words? The noose is not enough. It's also necessary to confine his story within a text, an official version that can be published, quoted, and waved like the final word on the revolt. Before the code, there is the pen. This is where Thomas R. Gray, a white and ambitious lawyer, comes into play, immediately grasping the potential of a document titled The Confessions of Nat Turner. A pamphlet that would, from the rebel's own mouth, deliver the integral story of his life, his visions, and his acts. To achieve this, he must first interrogate him. In a cell, in a narrow space saturated with the smells of sweat, dust, and smoke, the man of the law poses questions and the prisoner responds. Between them, an absolute asymmetry. One holds the key, the other has only his voice. We do not know exactly how long this exchange lasts, how many times they meet, how many formulations are repeated and rewritten. What we do know is that at the end of the process, a text emerges, signed by Gray's hand, but attributed to Nat Turner's words. In the pamphlet, everything seems proper, ordered, and coherent. Nat recounts his childhood, his visions, the eclipse, the decision to rise up, the march. He explains that he acted on divine orders, saw signs where others saw only natural phenomena. He describes the massacre with a nearly glacial distance, as if the spilled blood was merely the execution of a plan laid out by a superior hand. Gray presents himself as a simple scribe, a neutral witness who collected the rebels' words without altering them. But no serious archivist can wholly believe him. Each question posed shapes the answer. Each edit, each retained and omitted phrase transforms the confession into a controlled narrative. For white society, this text fills several functions at once. It assures, first of all, Nat Turner is not the product of an unjust system, but that of an isolated fanaticism, of a religious madness. One can also continue to defend slavery while rejecting the revolt into the register of individual delirium. Next, it offers a morbid spectacle, a story of violence and visions that sells well, circulates, and feeds the public's unhealthy curiosity. Finally, it allows for fixing Turner's figure in a convenient posture, that of a criminal who acknowledges his acts, explains his logic, and can be hanged while affirming that he had his chance to speak. But beneath this staging, we glimpse another Nat Turner, more difficult to reach, the one who, in his cell, knows that each word can be used against him and against his own, the one who knows that no matter what he says, he will not survive this story. Did he try to control his own narrative, to affirm one last time that he acted in the name of a God of justice and not out of a taste for blood? Or was he perhaps guided, coached to repeat what the interrogator wanted to hear? The truth is lost in the space between the recorded voice and the writing hand. All that remains for us is a hybrid text, at once a capital source and a piece of propaganda for the enslavers. The trial itself is rapid, nearly expeditious. Nat Turner is presented before the county court, surrounded by men who have already, in their minds, rendered their verdict. The charges are evident: insurrection, murder, conspiracy. There is neither suspense nor reasonable doubt. The court does not seek to understand, but to officialize what everyone already knows. He will be condemned to death. They read, listen to a few witnesses, pretend to respect the forms. Then the sentence falls cold, nearly administrative: hanging. The judicial apparatus has fulfilled its role, giving vengeance the form of a judgment. When the day of execution arrives, it's not a discreet affair. One does not hang a man like Nat Turner in a corner, in silence. They put on a show, they assemble people, they make it an exemplary spectacle, a ceremony of re-establishment of order. For some whites, attending this hanging is a way to assure themselves, seeing the body of the one who terrorized them, finally immobilized, vanquished, suspended. For some slaves, it's a moment of seething anger. They see the one who dared challenge the plantation's power reduced to a body swaying at the end of a rope. A warning, a clear message. This is what awaits those who dare imitate his gesture. On the scaffold, Nat Turner has only a few minutes of speech left, if they even let him speak at all. What does he say? The writings diverge. Some affirm that he was calm, almost cold, others that he remained silent, confined in a mute interior that even the word could not reach. Whatever the case, at the moment when the noose tightens, his voice is extinguished forever. What remains are the words of Gay, the sermons of the white pastors, the articles of the newspapers. In other words, a layer of discourse written by those who have an interest in making him a monster or in reducing him to a tragic but isolated figure. His body, after hanging, does not receive the honors of an ordinary sepulchre. In the most chilling writings, one speaks of dissection, of exposed remains, of dispersed limbs, as if the slave-owning society needed to destroy him physically piece by piece to be sure that he would never rise again in another form. This post-mortem violence says something essential. Nat Turner is no longer considered as a living individual but as a symbol. It is necessary to obsess over his body to try to erase the trace of what he has accomplished. And yet it is precisely these excesses, this age-old desire to control his image, that will guarantee his survival in memory. The pamphlet of Gay, conceived as an act of apology, will become an archive that one reads, later, against itself. The court records, the sermons, the furious editorials will be used, no longer as the only legitimate witnesses, but as proof of a deeper truth. Nat Turner hanged, Nat Turner dissected, Nat Turner cursed in texts. So many attempts to close a file that, in reality, never quite closes. In the days that follow his execution, the county of Southampton seems to return to its routine, the fields, the roads, the houses, the pieces of Sunday. But something has changed forever. The masters know now that a slave with a Bible and visions can shake an entire county. The slaves know that one of their own has refused to die according to the prescribed calendar, that he has chosen his own hour, however bloody it may be. Between these two knowledge bases, the archives fill with new laws, with fears, with justifications. And at the center of this labyrinth of paper, a silhouette remains hanged, but not erased, that of Nat Turner, whose confession, written in a cell, will long be the battleground where one disputes the very meaning of his revolt. Once the noose is placed around Nat Turner's neck, the authorities of Virginia could have considered that everything was over. The main rebels are dead, the bodies have been hanged, mutilated, exposed, the militias have disbanded, the patrols have become a little more spaced out. But slavery is not just a system of blows and hangings. It is also, and perhaps above all, a system of paper. Laws, decrees, articles of code written in black and white to enslave, surveil, suffocate. After the blood comes the time of ink. After the revolt comes the era of legal reprisals. In Richmond, as in other capitals of the South, the legislators meet. They listen to the reports coming from Southampton, the exaggerated writings of the newspapers, the rumors that still swell the amplitude of the revolt. They feign distance, cold spit, but the little beast crawls quietly in the corridors. There, behind the judicial formulas, an evidence imposes itself. The system they defend has just shown its vulnerability. A man educated in slavery, armed with visions and biblical verses, has succeeded in sowing panic throughout an entire county. The question in the assemblies is formulated thus. One speaks rather of public security, of preservation of order, of danger of new insurrections. But beneath this veneer, the real anguish is transparent. What would happen if other Nat Turners appeared elsewhere? The first responses allow the form of targeted restrictions. One identifies what made Turner dangerous. He knew how to read, he knew how to write, he preached. So one attacks these precise points. One discusses, one drafts bills to prohibit the teaching of reading and writing to slaves, to limit the possibilities of education, even for free blacks. One enforces the prohibitions of assemblies, especially religious ones, in the absence of white surveillance. One is particularly wary of black preachers, of those men who, like Turner, could transform the Bible into a weapon. One decides that speech from now on will be controlled as rigorously as bodies. In the new texts, the phrases are dry, impersonal. There is no question of anger, of vengeance, of fear. One speaks of security, of maintenance of peace, of good governance. But behind this apparent neutrality, one perceives a logic. Silence the voices, block the circulation of writings that could have nourished other revolts, restrict access to everything that allowed one to think otherwise about the condition of a slave. If Nat Turner was born in part from the encounter between a lively intelligence and scriptures, poorly mastered by those who pretended to use them to domesticate, then the remedy for the legislators is simple. Prevent the next generation from accessing these texts. In Virginia, the debates after 1831 sometimes take a surprising turn. In certain halls, a few white voices, minorities, dare to ask the real question: what if the revolt of Southampton was not an isolated accident, but a warning? And what if, to avoid other bloodbaths, it was necessary to consider, at least in the long term, a gradual emancipation, a progressive abolition of slavery? For a few weeks, perhaps a few months, the idea circulates. They weigh the costs, the risks, the consequences. They imagine plans, compensations, hybrid solutions. The ghost of Nat Turner haunts these debates. He is no longer there, but it is because of him that they are talking about things that a few years earlier they had not even dared to mention. But very quickly, the window closes. Fear takes over, not just the fear of other revolts, but the fear of losing economic, social, and racial control. Slavery is the backbone of the region's wealth. Abolition would mean, for many planters, to destroy their own economic foundation. The timid voices that evoked a possible end to the system are marginalized, ridiculed, sometimes labeled as naive or traitors to their class. The conclusion in the assemblies is fixed like a nail. Slavery will remain, but it will be more strictly framed. Fewer magistrates, fewer intermediaries, fewer gaps through which another Turner could pass. The laws that follow the revolt focus on everything that threatens and monitors. It is prohibited for free blacks to reside in certain states if they cannot justify impeccable papers. The possibility of freeing slaves is extinguished. The opportunities for whites and blacks to meet as equals are limited to a strict minimum. Suspicion becomes a judicial structure. Every contact, every word, every book that passes from hand to hand is potentially suspect. Black churches are placed under observation. Prayer meetings are monitored by white guards who ensure that the sermons do not take on a tone deemed too exalted. For slaves, these new invisible chains are as heavy as the old ones. Access to education, already limited, becomes almost impossible. Literate slaves must hide their abilities, conceal their books, read in secret like one hides a soul. Religious speech, which was sometimes a space for expression, becomes a minefield. The black preacher must calibrate each word, each image, so as not to give the impression of questioning the established order. The message about freedom, justice, divine wrath can be interpreted as an implicit call to revolt. After Turner, the Bible itself becomes suspect when held by black hands. On plantations, the message circulates through other means than codes, through blows and threats. Slaves are told that Southampton is a warning, that whoever raises their hand against a white person will not only be killed, but will also bring down dozens of others. They distort, at will, the details of the revolt, the trials, the executions. They insist on the mutilated corpses, the hanged bodies, the punishments inflicted on those accused of simply having listened to Turner. The whip is no longer just a tool of punishment, it becomes a daily lesson, a pedagogy of resignation. However, under this organized cloak of silence, memory circulates. In the cabins at night, they still whisper the name of Nat Turner, sometimes to curse him, since some slaves have paid dearly for his actions, sometimes to admire him in secret as one who dared, for a few days, to reverse the order of forces. The law may prohibit books, monitor sermons, close clandestine schools, but it cannot completely prevent the stories from being transmitted in a low voice, from hand to hand, from child to child, from man to man, in those areas of night where the white order does not hear everything. In the archives, on the other hand, the trace left by legal proceedings is clear. Entire pages of official journals detail the new prohibitions, the amendments to the black codes, the adjustments in the surveillance of slave and free populations of color. One can read these texts today and see the strategy of a system that has just been frightened and is preparing never to be surprised again. But what one can also hear in the background is an admission. It took only one man, one county, one night to force the dominant class to redefine its goals. Thus, after the revolt of Southampton, the chains do not disappear. They are perfected. The whip remains, but it is now doubled by a network of laws that seek to make the birth of a new Turner impossible. They want slaves who work, who pray docilely, who sing perhaps, but who do not read, do not preach, do not think of a God who reverses the powerful. In appearance, the system has been reinforced. In reality, with each new law, with each muzzle placed on the black voice, a shadow slips in, the proof that it has trembled, and this trembling, even carefully erased from official discourse, continues to vibrate in the silences, omissions, and lines of the codes. It is there, in these zones of judicial shadow, that the sequel is prepared. Not the immediate abolition, still distant, but the slow, inevitable erosion of the moral legitimacy of an order that has only responded to the revolt with more chains, more laws, more silence. When the hangings stop, when the militias return home, when the new laws are voted and recorded in the official registers, one might think that the story of Nat Turner is closed. A uprising, a repression, a few pages in the archives, and one moves on to something else. But this forgets one essential thing. Nothing in a system built on violence disappears so easily. The revolt of Southampton was not extinguished in the year 1831. It commences a new life, more substantial, longer, in memories, lives, poems, and souls. From then on, Nat Turner is no longer just a man who lived and was hanged. He becomes a battlefield, a stake, a question posed to each generation: what to do with a slave who has chosen blood as the language of history? On the side of white archives, the primary strategy is simple: encapsulate, educate, master. One confines the revolt as a criminal event, a derailment, the result of a dangerous religious fanaticism. One accumulates documents, trial transcripts, confessions of grey, indignant sermons, furious editorials. One draws, line after line, the portrait of a monster, a man presented as cold, calculating, possessed by a delirious vision, the suppression of which was necessary to better justify the enforcement of the slavery order. This narrative, for a long time, was the only one authorized in the public space. In textbooks, when his name appears, it is like a bloody parenthesis in a history that one prefers to recount from the viewpoint of masters, presidents, generals. But archives are never a homogeneous block. Among the trial papers, in the margins of journals, in private letters, one sometimes finds other tones. Planters who admit in half words their fear. Witnesses who, while condemning the revolt, link it to the brutality of the system. Observers of the North who, shocked by the massacre, nonetheless conclude that none of this would have occurred without the institution that enslaves thousands of human beings. Nat Turner also becomes a mirror that the slave-owning America would have liked to ignore. It sends back the image of an order that has itself produced the violence that strikes it. After abolition, one might have thought that his name was fading away, drowned in the flood of battles, proclamations, new myths. That is not the case. In the white South, especially in the nostalgic memory of the Old South, the revolt of 1831 is a convenient spectre. It is invoked to show that slaves, left to themselves, are capable of barbarity. It is used to justify, after the Secession War, the implementation of new control systems, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, segregation. Nat Turner becomes a shadow used to keep blacks in their place, to say, "Look what happens when they rise, we must be vigilant." The memory of Southampton is recycled in other domination devices. On the other side, in black memory, his image is more contradictory, more elusive. For some, especially those who promote respectability, moral ascension, the struggle for rights and dignity, Nat Turner is disturbing. He does not resemble the reassuring figures that one can offer to the white world to prove the ability of blacks to integrate into the national narrative. He is not a parliamentary orator, nor a patient educator, nor a champion of compromise. He is the one who took the Bible and used it like an axe. However, for others, radical militants, thinkers of armed resistance, he embodies exactly what official history tries to mask: the possibility that the response to structural violence may not always be peaceful. Over the decades, each black movement of contestation comes to cling to his name. During the Civil Rights Movement, some cite him as a warning. If America refuses marches, boycotts, pleadings, it will ultimately face other Southamptons. At the time of the Black Panthers and Black evolutionary currents, he is sometimes elevated to the rank of spiritual ancestor, figure of an absolute refusal, of an assumed rupture with the illusion of an equitable dialogue between master and slave. But even there, his heritage is complicated. How to reconcile the need to defend oneself and the acute awareness of the horror that represents the massacre of innocent children? Books, novels, essays all enter the battle. White authors take hold of his story, rewrite it, romanticize it, sometimes lending him thoughts, desires, contradictions that continue to fuel controversy. Some make him a tragic hero, others an ambiguous fanatic, others still a simple, symbolic figure at the service of their theses on guilt, violence, and grace. Each version triggers responses, criticisms, counter-narratives. Black authors, exasperated by these appropriations, try to reinvest in the figure of Turner to remove the caricatural mask in which he was confined. What is striking in this long war of interpretation is the quasi-total absence of the voice of the slaves themselves, contemporaries of the revolt. Their writings reach us only through the first person. They are filtered, transmitted, edited by white hands, or lost in the folds of time. Black memory of Nat Turner is also transmitted by fragments of stories, allusions, surnames, plantation legends. In certain oral writings, he becomes almost a mythological character, a man of God who dared to do what others have only imagined in the night. In others, the emphasis is on the repercussions, on the price paid, on the innocent families hit, a way of saying that the revolt was not only an act of courage but also a source of additional suffering. Modern historians, for their part, dig through archives, compare testimonies, dissect the famous confession. They try to untangle what comes from Nat and what comes from Gray, what is part of the staging and what seems to be an authentic word. They count the words, examine the itineraries, analyze the laws adopted after 1831. Some see in Turner a rebel, national, politicized, who chose the only path he considered still open. Others insist upon the mystic fervor, the unwavering conviction of being the instrument of a vengeful God. These discords remain unresolved, merely adding to the stratified layers of narratives like so many strata enshrouding the event's searing core, yet never quite consuming its essence. What endures beyond the cold calculus of figures, the stark pronouncements of dates, or the fervent skirmishes of interpretation, is a profound disquiet. Nat Turner compels America to confront a truth it perpetually relegates to the periphery. The notion that when faced with a chilling, lawful, and relentless violence, day after relentless day, certain enslaved souls harbor dreams not merely of flight or of reconciliation, but of striking back, of a brutal overthrow. His very image defies assimilation into narratives of linear progress or exemplary morality. It grates, it disquiets, it forces uncomfortable interrogations. To what extent may one strive for liberation from an inhumane system? Who, indeed, delineates the line where legitimate self-defense ceases and crime begins? Within an archive's hushed chambers, should one today venture to unseal the boxes dedicated to the Southampton Revolt, one would discover fragile yellowed parchments, some bearing ancient stains, registers of property wherein the aligned names of the enslaved lie juxtaposed against those of their white victims. Newspaper excerpts saturated with the venom of fear and hatred. Fragments of the Kai Confession, articulating the final pronouncements of a man acutely aware of his impending death. Nothing within these records possesses neutrality. Each document bears the indelible impress of a faction, a perspective, a vested interest. Yet when arrayed in stark juxtaposition, a semblance of an image begins to coalesce. That of a society so utterly convinced of its dominion over human flesh that it utterly failed to comprehend the inexorable logic of those who one day chose to rise, even at the cost of losing all. Nat Turner lingers within these very pages, a perforated presence, neither saint nor fiend nor mere symptom. Simply a man born into a world that denied his inherent humanity, who chose to answer that negation with a violence that, in its turn, denied other lives. Between those who would sculpt him into an absolute hero and those who would fashion him into a convenient monster, the interstice is narrow. Yet it is precisely there that the most disquieting truth resides. The realization that a system as brutal as slavery could not, in its very nature, hope to engender solely silent victims or perfectly amenable martyrs. Some, like Nat Turner, elected to inscribe their defiance in blood, and perhaps it is for this very reason that 2 centuries hence his name continues to haunt archives, books, and fervent debates. For he permits neither the balm of oblivion nor the solace of easy comfort. He leaves in his wake an unanswerable question, one that vastly transcends the bounds of Southampton County. What becomes of a nation that meticulously constructs its prosperity upon the shackle, when, one fateful day, that shackle shatters from the other side?